Welcome to our last speaker event for the academic speaker series here at Landmark College. I'm Lynn Shea. I'm a professor in the Liberal Studies department here. And it's my pleasure to introduce Adrienne Major, a professor of literature here for many years. Adrienne received her undergraduate degree from Smith College and her Ph.D. from Tufts. And she has been working, last year she received a sabbatical to research and travel around New England, research New England writers. So this work is part of that research. And she also teaches a class on New England writers. So without further ado, Adrienne Major, New England Gothic.
Thank you all so much, and welcome. The film that was on while you were coming in is a rather long and independently produced film that takes King James I of England's brilliant best-selling book, Demonology, and which it was written as a series of dialogues and films the whole thing in old pronunciation. I mention this to you in case you want to go and take a look at it on your own. I put up this work of early modern literature because the first part of my talk is about what the Puritans and the separatists bring with them when they come to this country. This, if I can say, for them, new world. And one of the things that haunts them, and consequently still haunts us, is this belief in witchcraft. So let me get out of this film and into my presentation, and we will begin. So when I was asked what I wanted to do for my sabbatical presentation, and was presented with the date of November 1st in which to deliver it, I thought, what better to do than to look at what a tradition we have here in New England of horror. What we have of using the fear of the world around us and the community within which we live to produce the chilling effects that we look for in our Gothic writers, in our horror writers. So this presentation is really going to zero in on that. My agenda is pretty straightforward. We're going to start with the inheritance, right? What did the Puritans bring over with them? Then we're going to take a look at the witch trials. And notice that I'm taking witch trials in general and not necessarily Salem in specific. There were witch trials prosecuted all over New England, primarily in New England, but there were also witch trials in Virginia and New Mexico as well. It was kind of rife at this time period, not just here in North America, but certainly still ongoing in England and in Europe. Then we're going to take a look at a couple of short pieces of literature. The first will be Young Goodman Brown, which I hope most of you are familiar with. And if not, I hope this talk inspires you to rush out and read it. It's really quite good and quite short. So we're going to take a look at how the natural world becomes this evil and mystifying presence within Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. But that's not the worst evil that exists. Then we're going to skip up to 1940s Vermont and take a look at Shirley Jackson's most famous short story, The Lottery. Again, just a brilliant evocation of small town New England community. And we'll try to draw some conclusions from this and maybe have a little discussion at the end. This is my transitional slide. Actually, this woodcut is from 1720, so it's a little bit later than when I'm talking about, but it does bring us into this idea of the witches' Sabbath and the sort of equal opportunity cabal that's going on here. So, for this section, what the Puritans brought with them, I'm going to lean heavily on a couple of books that are available in our library. These are David Hall's Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment, in which he looks at the folk traditions that kind of underlie the religious traditions of the New England Puritans. And Michael Winship's brilliant book, Hot Protestants, A History of Protestantism in England and America. And I have to explain, or maybe I don't, that he takes the title from a pamphlet that's written against Protestants, and that's simply essentially saying that these Protestants are so hot under the collar that they're willing to fight for their ideas, quite literally. So for this section, I want to take a look at religion, the wilderness, and ideas of magic. Religion during most of the 16th and 17th centuries involved heated arguments, which is putting it lightly, battles, imprisonments, and executions over the question of who should lead the church and under whose authority. It's interesting to me that both the Puritans and the Separatists came over to this country hoping really to establish a godly place that was functionally a theocracy. But they were so opposed to having a central authority or head of the church that they invented Congregationalism, which means that the polity of the church or the power of the church is placed on the members of the congregation themselves. They are the ones with authority. And that is what, even though they never intended this, starts us on our journey towards the separation of church and state. All right, there we go. All right. So we're wondering about church polity, but at the same time, the religion that both the Puritans and the Separatists, and I should explain that I'm talking about Separatists in terms of Mayflower Pilgrims, the really small group that started a really super small colony in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And then Puritans are a rather larger, wealthier, and better established group that begin to settle Salem and Boston and the rest of the Massachusetts Bay colony. So Separatists, Pilgrims, Mayflower, Puritans, Great Migration, the rest of Massachusetts. What both of these people had in common was that their religion demanded of them to look closely at themselves for signs that they were predestined amongst the elect. So let me step back and explain that for a second. We're talking Calvinism here. We're talking predestination. God is almighty and all-powerful and all-knowing, and God has determined way back in time which one of us is going to hell and which one of us is going to heaven. And that's all set, and there's not a bloody thing we can do about it. And here's the kicker, we don't know who's who. So we have to search for signs and portents to let us know that we're on the right path, to let us know that we are the elect. And so our culture way back when is just full of introspection and self-help. I mean, that's where we're coming from, right? How do we know that we're doing the right thing? Oh, there's a cloud. It's moving across the sky. And it's stopping over there. Left, right. The way we read. The way the words are in the Bible. We're going the right way, right? So everything can be interpreted, and as a result, everything is. But the problem is, we're not sure if our interpretations are correct or not. So the entire world is open for us to interpret, and we only pray that we interpret it the right way. Finally, when I'm talking about religion in New England, I want to read a kind of a lengthy quotation from David Hall. If I have my glasses, which I do, hurrah. Talking about what we didn't bring over from the old country. He writes, "You may include in the list banishment of holidays, maypoles." No, he doesn't write that. I wrote that. Sorry. Banishment of holidays, maypoles, remnants of folk or pagan path. He writes, "No saint days or Christmas, no weddings or church ales, no pilgrimages, no sacred places, no relics or ex-photos, no churching after childbirth, no godparents or maypoles, no fairy tales, no dancing on the Sabbath, no carnival." Events that were commonplace in much of Europe were not recreated in New England, nor was this accidental. The differences ran deep into the structure of society and the structure of religion. All right. So thus far, religion. Now let me talk for a second about wilderness. Here I'm showing, this is the recreation of the Mayflower 2, and I'm going to jump up. Peter, I need your pointer. You can see on the mid-deck there, people standing, just to give you some idea of the size of this thing. It's so small. And we crammed 200 people essentially here, below decks. Yeah? And sailed, starting in October, bad idea. Across the Atlantic, really, really bad idea. I'm looking at my husband who's like, yeah, October sounds great. And landing in Massachusetts in December. And not only landing in Massachusetts in December, but landing in Massachusetts in December in the middle of what is called the Little Ice Age was a good, on average, 5 degrees colder during the winter, from about 1600 to 1680, I think, were the dates there. There were frost fairs on the Thames. It was cold and nasty and miserable. And if that wasn't bad enough, the idea of the wilderness in the Bible is not a friendly place. And these people were very biblically oriented. So what I want to do right now is read you a long quotation from William Bradford from his On Plymouth Plantation, in which he spends a good deal of time stating where they came to and what they expected to find. I'm afraid I can't do old pronunciation, so you're just going to have to put up with sort of a modern reading of this work. He writes, "But here I cannot but stay and make pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition." He's writing about them just coming off of the Mayflower. "And so I think will the reader too, when he considers the same. Being thus past the vast ocean, and a sea of troubles before in their preparation, as may be remembered by it which went before. And they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses or much less towns to repair to seek for succor. In this case, succor means help. It is recorded in the scripture as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked company that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. But these savage barbarians," and here I make an apology to our Native American brethren and sistren, for his expectations here. Savage barbarians, he says. "When they met with them, as after it will appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for the reason it was winter. And they that know the winters of this country know them to be sharp and violent, and subject to cruel and fierce storms, dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search out an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes there might be they knew not, neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah, to view from this wilderness a more godly country, to feed their hopes. For whichever way soever they turned their eyes, save up to the heavens, they could have so little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For summer being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they passed, and was now the main bar and gulf to separate them from all the civil parts of the world. If it be said they had a ship to succor them, it is true. But what heard they daily from the master and the company? But if with speed they should outplace their shallop, where they would be at some distance, for the season such as he would not stir from thence till safe harbor were discovered by them, where they should be, that he might go without danger." So, of course, Bradford had a couple of purposes for writing this, but I think that what we see in this long quotation is the place of the wilderness in the Puritan imagination, right? It's savage, it's brutal, it's unknown, it's scary, and there's nothing there that's going to welcome them. All right. So finally, oh my God, finally, I want to talk a little bit about magic. Obviously, the film in the beginning showed you a bit, but I liked this quotation from David Hall again. "It may surprise some readers to discover how much magic circulated in New England. We tend to think that all magic is interdicted, but it's not. The magic, there's good magic and there's bad magic. There's magic that's okay to practice, and there's magic that's really evil to practice. And like figuring out the signs, it's up to each one of us to figure out which magic is being practiced." So, so here we are. We have the magic of murder without prophetic dreams and visions, pins hammered into buildings, shape-shifting dogs, and much more beside. The religion of the colonists was infused with ancient attitudes and practices, some indeed so old as to antedate the rise of Christianity. Much of this magic was in disfavor by the close of the 17th century, but the persistence of these old beliefs is one reason why it is wise to look at the colonists as Elizabethans and not think of them as being proto-modern. I just want to say a word at this point about alchemy, because one of the things that did surprise me was how many people practiced alchemy. At this point, alchemy, of course, is not altogether a crackpot idea for turning lead into gold, but rather the latest in discovering scientific knowledge. It was, and I quote, a progressive science that promised to produce benefits in medicine, mining, metallurgy, industrial processing, textile dyeing, and manufacturing. And this is a quotation from Woodward, who is, whoops, that I did not mean to do, sorry about that, who is writing about the Connecticut witch trials. So the line between which alchemy is good alchemy was kind of a close-run thing. Two of the major influences on alchemical studies, the English natural philosophers John Dee and Robert Fludd, had both been falsely accused of practicing witchcraft as a result of their studies. So, finally, let's turn, I mean, this isn't the end of my talk yet, but let's turn now from what did the Puritans bring with them to how did the witch trials work? I think you probably all have a pretty good idea, informed perhaps by the Crucible and by your own reading into the question of, or your visits to Salem, about the Salem witch trials and the ways that these trials were engendered, how they were prosecuted, and how they ended up. I want to recommend two additional books to you. The first is The Detestable and Wicked Arts by Paul Mayer. And despite this great title, this is kind of a very careful and scholarly look at who were the witches, what were their demographics, what were their marriages, who were the accusers, and so on and so forth. So if you want to know the details, the historiographical details about the witch trials, this book is your book. And then the other book is a really fascinating study called Witchcraft in North America. It first of all presents several essays and then a bunch of primary sources that you can read from the Connecticut witch trials, from the Salem witch trials, and from witch trials in Virginia and New Mexico as well, so that you can put this all into a North American context and bring it out that way. So, who were the accusers in a witch trial? Usually your neighbors, because you're living in small villages and you have constant relations with your neighbors. There was an interesting study, again, in Detestable and Wicked Arts, that looked at who the accusers were, and usually the number one accusers was your next door neighbor. And then the secondary accusers maybe lived 2 houses over. And who were the accused? 12 twice as many men than women, twice as many women than men, but there were men who were accused. Children were not accused because they were considered to be below the age of reason. They couldn't be held responsible for their actions. The age of witches, interestingly, is pretty even across the demographic board. So we have witches in their 20s and 30s, witches in their 40s and 50s, witches in their 60s and 70s. Fewer of those because people just didn't tend to live that long. So I want to take this opportunity to read to you about the case of the Goodwins. Goodwins were a family, I believe in Connecticut, in 1666, whose children fell suddenly ill of a very mysterious illness. The second oldest of their 6 living children, 13-year-old Martha, had been struck down with some dreadful and apparently life-threatening illness. The Goodwins struggled to understand what sins had provoked God to inflict it. So remember that sort of self-reflection and introspection going on there. Then Martha's symptoms got worse and stranger, and the 3 younger siblings started behaving similarly. Now, any of you with younger siblings or any of you parents may recognize the symptoms that we're experiencing here. Their joints stiffened and then went impossibly slack. They cried out that they were being stabbed and beaten. They all got sudden pains at the same time in different parts of their bodies. These once dutiful children, whose parents kept them continually busy, would take forever to do the simplest chores and would break into the most grievous and woeful, heartbreaking agonies when they were scolded. Sometimes they would shriek or seemingly go deaf when someone was praying or reading the Bible. The response to this is fascinating. So people started flocking to the Goodwins' house to watch the kids. Oh my God. And share their concerns and opinions about this extraordinary group illness. Some of the Goodwins' neighbors told them that they could use time-honored remedies like boiling the children's urine over a fire, perhaps with nails thrown in, to end the children's suffering and attack the witch. The Goodwins refused to catch the devil with the devil's own tools, but remembered that just before Martha became ill, she had had an altercation with an Irish washerwoman over some missing linen. The washerwoman's mother, a Gaelic widow, about whom it's questionable whether she spoke or understood a word of English, came over to scold Martha for accusing her daughter. To Goodwin, it seemed obvious that Glover, the Gaelic woman, was a witch. Not the least, Winship writes, because she was poor, old, and a woman, the clearest warning signs of a witch in both Old and New England. So this accusation was astonished I don't have a note about this. Oh, I do. This accusation was just lapped up by Cotton Mather, who was fascinated by witches and witchcrafts. He was also, in his own way, brilliant, a genius, had written more than 40 books by the time he was 30, exploring all nature of things. Here I write his bestseller, Memorable Providences, features the case of the Goodwin children. You can see him in the corner of their bedroom taking notes, right? And then he takes Glover into his house. I think it's the daughter, not the mother. The mother gets hanged as a witch. And tries to determine whether he can get the devil out of her or not. So I present this to you as a case of thorough self-interest on Cotton Mather's part. I may be doing him a disservice. I just want to be quite honest about that. All right, so prosecutors. We have a list of names here for Hartford, the Connecticut witch trials, and for Salem, the Salem witch trials. But what I want you to know about the names on this list are that these first guys, the first three here, Reverend Samuel Stone, Joseph Haynes, and Samuel Hooker, they were they were what you call hanging judges. They would take the accused into their courtroom and just batter them with questions until they broke down and confessed, essentially. And the Hartford witch trials were going along pretty merrily until John Winthrop Jr. Came home from England and and John Winthrop Jr. is an interesting fellow, son of the governor of Massachusetts, who wrote the famous City on the Hill sermon. He's now the governor of Connecticut, and he's a doctor. And an alchemist and a governor. And because of his study of alchemy, he is suspicious about the accusations of witchcraft, and manages to suppress the Connecticut witch trials pretty handily. Before they can really get a good grip on the population. Then in the Salem witch trials, we have John Hathorne, Jonathan Corwin, the deputy governor, assistants, and all of these men are magistrates, important people of the town of Salem and the colony of Massachusetts. And here I have a long quotation from Cotton Mather about how they really need to get a handle on these witches, which I think I am not going to read for a matter of time. I want to then transition to my next slide just by reading the 8th bullet point in Cotton Mather's exhortation to the judges of Salem to do a really good job of making sure no witch will live, by saying, nevertheless, we cannot but humbly recommend to the government the speedy and vigorous prosecution of such as have rendered themselves obnoxious according to the directions given in the laws of God and the wholesome statutes of the English nation for the detection of witchcraft. Finally, a word about spectral evidence. This is the evidence of the visions. And the picture I've put here in the background is of the black dog, a figure that appears both in English folklore and in the Salem witch trials as part of this kind of visionary spectral evidence. So, come to Nathaniel Hawthorne, rather young portrait of him. Hawthorne is the great-great-grandson of the Salem witch trials judge John Hathorne. Notice that Hathorne, in a couple of slides before, spelled his name Hathorne, and Hawthorne, when he reaches the age of 27, plops a W into his name, legally changing it so that he can separate himself from this Puritan ancestor. He publishes Young Goodman Brown in 1835. And he's very similar in the way that he uses the papers of his Puritan ancestry to Sir Walter Scott, his older contemporary, also an antiquarian, who uses the history of Scotland, as it happens, to inform his popular novels. So Hawthorne is using the history of Salem and the history of New England to inform the new short stories that he's writing. So, the plot. There's a young man. He has to go on a night's journey into the woods with a mysterious older man with whom he has an appointment. An appointment for an errand that is never mentioned or clarified in the book. He has to do this journey on this particular night with this particular man. This mysterious older man bears a serpent-like staff that occasionally throughout the story wriggles and hisses. So what happens? He goes in to the woods. And I want to read you the paragraph where he's just starting to enter them. And what I want you to listen for is what the woods are starting to symbolize here, right? He states on the paragraph before, after this one night, I'll cling to my wife's skirts, and his wife's name is Faith, by the way. I'll cling to her skirts and follow her to heaven. With this excellent resolve for the future, Goodman Brown felt himself justified in making more haste on his present evil purpose. He had taken a dreary road, darkened by all the gloomiest trees of the forest, which barely stood aside to let a narrow path creep through and closed immediately behind it. It was all as lonely as could be. And there is this peculiarity in such solitude, that the traveler knows not who may be concealed by the innumerable trunks and thick boughs overhead, so that with lonely footsteps he may yet be passing through an unseen multitude. And recall what William Bradford had written. We have no idea what multitudes these woods conceal. So Hawthorne is calling on this unknowability, this community in solitude, and this stepping away from the civilization of the village and into the wild unknown of the forest. It is there that he meets this stranger, and Hawthorne is careful to tell us that they might have been taken for father and son. And I think there we have this worry, this anxiety about the ancestry kind of creeping through into the story. Might have been father and son. We will but walk, said he of the serpent, smiling apart, a little way into the forest. So he's luring Goodman Brown, who's already made this appointment, by the way. I mean, he's set. We all know that when you make a deal with the devil, it's really hard to wiggle out of it. And Goodman Brown, he struggles, but he's bound, right, by promises that he's made to this peculiar man. So it's in this forest that he does witness every single person he knows in town having part of the witches' covenant, the devil's cabal. In ordinary Gothic literature, the locus of the fear is the haunted castle or the abbey, right? But once we get over into New England, the locus of fear moves from that inside to this outside. And what Hawthorne does is bring us to the middle of the forest, yet describes it as if it itself were a ruined abbey. Let me see if I can get into this section where I found that. Here we go. At one extremity of an open space hemmed in by the dark wall of the forest arose a rock bearing some rude natural resemblance either to an altar or a pulpit, and surrounded by 4 blazing pines, their tops aflame, their stems untouched, like candles at an evening meeting. The mass of foliage that had overgrown the summit of the rock was all on fire, blazing high into the night and fitfully illuminating the whole field. Each pendant twig and leafy festoon was in a blaze. As the red light rose and fell, the numerous congregation alternately shone forth and then disappeared in shadow. Again it grew, as it were, out of the darkness, peopling the heart of the solitary wood. So instead of a haunted castle, we have a haunted wood. Instead of a cathedral, we have the facsimile of our church with its pulpit in the middle of this wilderness. And what happens within this wilderness is that everybody's secrets are revealed. Remember when we were talking about the witch trials, we talked about the closeness of neighbors and how neighbors would tell on one another and accuse one another. Well, here, in this odd about turn in the way that Hawthorne is using the memory of the witch trials, this young man is convinced that everybody he knows in the village who is good is here and is evil. The devil says, "This night shall be granted you to know their secret deeds. How hoary bearded elders of the church have whispered wanton words to young maids of their households. How many a woman, eager for widow's weeds, has given her husband a drink at bedtime and let him sleep his last sleep in her bosom. How beardless youths have made haste to inherit their father's wealth. And how fair damsels, blush not, sweet ones, have dug little graves in the garden and bidden me, the sole guest, to an infant's funeral." So here we see the makings and the reverberations of the things that are still horrifying us to this day. What happens at the end of this story? Hawthorne leaves us in grave doubt about whether Goodman Brown actually saw all this or whether he didn't. But what we do see is a ruined man, a man who can no longer trust anyone in his community, a man who lives a long and grim and unhappy, tortured existence, not being able to have faith in either his wife or his community or his God. I realize I've left but little time for Shirley Jackson's Lottery. So I'm going to do a very quick overview of what she does within her short story. So She wrote The Lottery in 1948, and it got published, and it was one of the most controversial stories ever to be published in the New Yorker. It prompted over 300 letters from readers, many of them outraged at its conjuring of a dark aspect of human nature. I don't know why they were so surprised. Characterized, as Jackson put it, so she's reviewing these letters, and she's saying, people are bewildered. They're characterized by bewilderment, speculation, and, alas, old-fashioned abuse. How could a woman write such a thing? So her husband joins the faculty of Bennington College in 1945. She becomes the principal breadwinner of her family as her husband's alcoholism grows worse. And she somehow manages to balance out both humor and terror in her life and in her work. I just want to make a note that in moving to Vermont in the 1940s, Jackson would have been moving into a very, very distressed state, a state that is hardly recovering from the Depression, a state where farms are struggling, and many of them going out, where the landscape is running downhill. And so it is into this sort of darkness and change that Jackson is coming and observing, and what feeds, I think, some of the horror of The Lottery. How many of you read The Lottery? Awesome. So, spoiler alert. We have, just as with Hawthorne, we have this wonderful bucolic start with this simple and elegant, not elegant, simple and down-home village gathering where people are recognized by both name and the positions that they hold in the village. She writes, "The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns where there's so many people, the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 2nd. But in this village, where there were only 300 people, so essentially, it's the size of Landmark College, a little smaller. In this village, the whole lottery took less than 2 hours. So it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in enough time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. The children assembled first, then the men, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. She writes, they stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner." This is right in the beginning of the story, and already we have this pile of stones that we're mentioning. The kids are playing with them, but we don't know what's going to happen with them. They are there. The lottery was conducted, as were square dances, the teen club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers. So we have the idea that the lottery is part of everyday village life, or at least annual village life, like town meeting. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put in use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. She goes into some detail in describing this box, and she describes it mostly by its neglect. It's losing its paint. It was bashed in on one side and they haven't bothered to fix it. There is the suggestion that they should replace it, but they don't. They want to forget this thing year by year by year. It lowers over the story the way the pile of stones does in the corner. In describing the beginning of the lottery, Jackson calls on the ideas of tradition and village life, the ideas that bring a community together. And by doing so, and I think this is where a lot of those 300 letters comes from, she perverts the idea of this community. There was the proper swearing in of Mr. Summers by the postmaster as the official of the lottery. At one time, some people remembered there had been a recital of some sort performed by an official of the lottery, a perfunctory, tuneless chant that had been rattled off duly each year. Some people believed that the official of the lottery used to stand just so when he said or sang it, and others believed that he was supposed to walk among the people. But years and years ago, this part of the ritual had been allowed to lapse. So we have the intimation of change, but the clinging still to a ritual that they cannot let go. Indeed, as the lottery continues, as people draw the slips of paper for their families and the tension mounts, there's discussion in the village about other villages that have stopped their lotteries and how blasphemous that is. When we finally get down to the family who has been chosen for the lottery, it is so quiet in Jackson's story that you can almost hear a pin drop. After that, she writes, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, till Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a minute, no one moved. Jackson uses this suspense, our suspense as readers, to reinforce the suspense that's happening in the village itself. And when we finally end up with Tessie Hutchinson getting the black mark, that suspense is released. And so is the palpable evil of this lottery. Jackson writes, although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use the stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready. There were stones on the ground with blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box Delacroix had come out of the box. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands, and she turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said. "Hurry up." Tessie Hutchinson was in the center of a cleared space by now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of her head. It isn't fair. It isn't right. Conclusions. If Southern Gothic places itself within or locates itself within the loss and the madness at the end of the Civil War, New England Gothic locates itself in both the natural world and the community which isolates within that world. It finds evil, yes, to some extent in the world around us, but more evil within each one of us, and strives to use our connections, both with nature and with community, to reinforce what that horror is when the community falls apart, when the community betrays you, when you cannot move any further within these relationships with other people. I stop my talk with Shirley Jackson in 1948. But as you know, horror is still being produced today. And I want to suggest, as heirs of these great forebears, Stephen King. His first novel, Carrie, of course, is all about the abuse of community that's suffered by his heroine, and then her evilly lashing out. And so that we recognize both the horror that she releases and the horror that she suffers. And I want to mention Donna Tartt's first novel, Secret Histories, exactly. Bennington College again, I don't know what it is about Bennington, where a classics class get involved in horrifying bacchanalian rituals and murder until all of them disintegrate into death and madness. It's a great book. Beautifully written, horrifying to read. And this concludes my talk. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. I really appreciate it.
We have time for a few questions, if everyone can.
Yes.
As the threat of the wilderness has kind of drawn away from our common lives, and as communities have become less dominant in our modern life and more fractured, where do you see kind of New England Gothic going forward? You know, where do you think the next great?
Well, I think that's an interesting, I really like the way you phrased that question, but I want to argue with its premise, because I think even though communities are fracturing, they're still where we're discovering locuses of evil. And those communities might not be in our villages anymore, but they sure are online. And we're seeing this whole sort of embracier of sort of the evil impulses being reinforced within those communities. The natural world, I think, is an interesting question, and I wonder, as we're getting more and more separated from it through our digital lives, whether it might not reemerge as a place both of wonder and of terror. Thank you.
The other thing I think of is that as we've had it less directly as a fear, it's also coming back in the form of climate change as something that's even more all-encompassing.
Such an awesome point. Yeah. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
I always have wondered, women have been remarkably quiet or silenced. We hear all about the Salem Witch Trials, the Connecticut Witch Trials. We always hear about them from the male perspective. And I was interested that you mentioned Shirley Jackson. And I'm just wondering what other women have actually explored this subject, if there are other notable New England women, and how soon did they, like when did they start writing?
About the witch trials, you mean?
About the witch trials, about horror, about Gothic themes.
So I think that I think you can say that they started very soon. Even we could go back to Mary Rowlandson, right? With her memoir about being captured by savage Indians and so on and so forth. And so this sort of theme of women being victims, being within horrifying circumstances, would have started in the 18th century, and certainly by the 19th century, we have some strong Gothic writers coming out. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for instance, comes to mind. Her marvelous Yellow Wallpaper, right? And so I think that, and Gothic itself is one of those genres that's not, it's not sophisticated, and so it's been left to women, and women have largely dominated it. So it is unusual, actually, for Hawthorne to write in that genre, and he himself feels uneasy and anxious about doing it, and spits out a lot of vitriol about scribbling women and how awful they are. Yes.
So you mentioned witch trials in Europe. From what research I've done, the Catholic Church basically said that witchcraft doesn't exist. So for the most part, Catholic countries did not, or from what I can tell, there were far fewer and mostly condemned witch trials in places like France and Italy. Have you found something like, where you were talking about the witch trials in Europe, where did you find records for those?
Largely in Germany, which of course is at the height of the Reformation, isn't it? So, yeah. Yes?
How would you compare the piece you read from Hawthorne and how it compares to nature to like more modern, like Stephen King, The Girl Who Loved Tom Norton?
That's a great question. I have to confess that even though I've done this whole talk about horror, I really don't read horror. It scares me to death. So I can talk about Hawthorne, but I can't talk about Stephen King. So Hawthorne is on the edges of the transcendentalist movement, the idea that through nature you can get in touch with a higher being, you can sort of do this communication with the all soul, the oversoul. And so a lot of Hawthorne's writing is actually rhapsodic about nature. And it's really when he's doing this sort of accusation of the Puritans that he turns nature into something that's horrifying. And he thinks that that is actually a crime. He feels that that's one of the mistakes that the Puritans made. I did not address that in my talk, and so thank you for giving me a chance to sort of correct the record on Hawthorne at any rate.
Well, once again, let's thank Adrienne for her.
Thank you very much.